Here's the first segment of your story, told in the first person perspective. The ocean stretched endlessly before us, a vast and unbroken expanse of deep blue. The sun was beginning to sink, casting long golden streaks across the water, making it look almost too serene. But beneath that beauty, I felt something else, a strange unease that I couldn't quite shake. Maybe it was the way the waves lapped too gently against the side of our boat, as if urging us forward rather than resisting. Or maybe it was the old sailor's warning still echoing in my head. "Stay away from that island," he had said, his voice low and grave. "No one who goes there ever comes back the same." Yet here we were, a group of 5, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and the thrill of the unknown. Max, our so-called leader, had found a faded map in an old maritime journal. A crude sketch of an island in the middle of nowhere with no name, just a series of strange symbols drawn beside it. He was convinced it was worth exploring. He had a way of making even the most absurd ideas sound like grand adventures. I wasn't so sure. As we sailed closer, the air seemed to grow heavier. The sky remained clear, but there was an unnatural stillness, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. Then, through the mist that had begun to gather, I saw it, the island. It rose out of the water like a jagged wound against the horizon. Dark cliffs lined its edges, and beyond them, dense jungle stretched inward, a tangle of ancient trees that seemed untouched by time. It looked abandoned, uninhabited, but that didn't mean it was empty. We anchored just offshore, lowering the small boat into the water. The moment I stepped onto the island, a shiver ran through me. The sand was cold beneath my feet, colder than it should have been. The air smelled damp, thick with the scent of moss and something else, something decayed. "No footprints," Sophie murmured, looking down at the unbroken stretch of beach. "No signs of life." We moved cautiously toward the jungle's edge, the path ahead of us swallowed by shadows. Trees loomed high, their gnarled branches stretching overhead like twisted arms. Vines hung down in thick ropey strands, and beneath them the ground was uneven, littered with rocks and something else, old bones, half buried in the dirt. "Animal bones," Max said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Deeper in, the air grew oppressively thick. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional rustle of unseen things moving just beyond our vision. Then we saw it, a structure hidden within the overgrowth. An old stone building, its walls covered in creeping ivy, its doorway gaping open like a black maw. I felt my pulse quicken. "There was a village here," Daniel muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "A long time ago." I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how small we were in this place, how unwelcome. Something about this island felt wrong. It wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting, watching, and we had just walked right in. The moment we stepped inside the crumbling structure, the temperature dropped. Not just a little, a sudden biting cold that made my skin prickle. The air felt dense, thick with the weight of something unseen. The others noticed it too. Sophie rubbed her arms, her breath coming out in shallow puffs. Max, ever the skeptic, exhaled sharply. "Just the shade," he muttered. "This place is old, damp. Cold air gets trapped in ruins like these." But this wasn't just cold air. It felt wrong. The interior was vast, the ceiling high and arched, though parts of it had caved in, letting streaks of dull grey light seep through. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols etched deep into the stone, their meanings lost to time. Some looked almost like eyes, watching us. Others resembled twisted figures, arms raised in what could have been agony or worship. Daniel ran his fingers over one of the carvings, his expression darkening. These don't look like regular tribal symbols. I didn't want to know what they were. I just wanted to leave. Then the whispering started. It was faint at first, like the wind slipping through cracks in the stone. But it carried an unmistakable rhythm. Soft, murmuring voices, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I turned sharply, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. Just dust floating in the still air, illuminated by the slanted light. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Sophie nodded slowly. "It sounded close," Max scoffed. "It's the wind. Come on, let's check the back. There might be another exit leading deeper into the ruins." No one really wanted to, but we followed. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The air smelled stagnant, like something rotting just beneath the surface. The floor was uneven, cracked stone covered in patches of moss. And God, was that blood? Dark, rust-colored stains smeared the ground, old but unmistakable. Then Daniel stopped abruptly. "Where's Alex?" I spun around. He was right. Alex, who had been right behind us moments ago, was gone. "Alex?" Max called out, his voice echoing through the ruins. Nothing. Just the whispering, growing a little louder now. I pulled out my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the empty space behind us. Shadows stretched and twisted against the stone, playing tricks on my eyes. Then the light caught something. A figure standing at the entrance of another chamber, just beyond our reach. "Alex?" I called. The figure didn't move. I took a cautious step forward, shining the light directly at it. And then I saw it wasn't Alex at all. It was something else. A figure, tall and thin, its body draped in tattered remnants of clothing that barely clung to its skeletal frame. Its face, there was no face. Just hollow, empty darkness where eyes should have been, where a mouth should have been. And yet somehow, I knew it was looking at me. The whispers rose into a chorus, surrounding us from all sides. The walls seemed to shift, pressing in closer. The thing didn't move, but I could feel its presence pushing against me, filling the space with something ancient, something hungry. Then Sophie screamed. I turned just in time to see her stumbling back, her hands clutching at her throat as if something unseen had wrapped around it. Max grabbed her, pulling her away, but she was gasping, eyes wide with terror. "Go!" Daniel shouted. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran, tearing through the ruins, back the way we came, the whispers now a deafening roar in our ears. I could feel something behind us close, too close. Cold fingers seemed to brush against my back, my arms, but I didn't dare look. We burst out into the open, the heavy jungle air wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. Sophie collapsed onto the sand, coughing, her breaths ragged. The rest of us stood frozen, our hearts pounding, waiting, expecting something to follow us out, but nothing did. The ruins stood silent, unchanged. Alex was still missing. Sophie was still gasping for air, her hands shaking as she gripped her own throat. Her eyes darted wildly, unfocused, as if she was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. Max knelt beside her, his expression tense. But he didn't know what to do. None of us did. "Breathe, Sophie," I said, my own voice trembling. "You're okay. You're out." She wasn't okay. None of us were. Daniel stood at the entrance of the ruins, his flashlight beam sweeping across the dark interior, searching for any sign of Alex. But there was nothing. The whispering had stopped the moment we left. Now, there was only the steady sound of the waves crashing against the shore. "This isn't right," Daniel muttered. He was right behind us. I knew what he was implying. Alex hadn't just wandered off. Something had taken him. "We have to go back," Max said, his jaw tight. "No," Sophie gasped, her voice raw. "No, we can't go back in there." She grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, her fingers ice cold. Her nails dug into my skin as she pulled me closer, her lips barely moving as she whispered, "It's awake." A chill ran down my spine. "What's awake?" I asked, my voice barely above a breath. She didn't answer, just shook her head violently. Max exhaled sharply and stood up. "We can't just leave him. 5 of us came here, 5 of us leave." Daniel and I exchanged a look. We knew he was right, but every part of me screamed not to go back in. There was something in those ruins, something watching us, waiting. Something that had already taken Alex. Sophie grabbed my arm again, shaking her head. "Don't," she pleaded. "It won't let you." But we had no choice. Max led the way, stepping back inside, and I followed, my heart hammering in my chest. The air inside was colder than before, the silence even heavier. The ruins no longer felt empty. It was as if the very walls were breathing, alive with something ancient. Daniel called out for Alex again, but his voice seemed swallowed by the darkness. The strange markings on the walls looked different now, shifting, twisting as though they had taken on a life of their own. I tried not to look at them. Then I saw it. At the far end of the chamber, where Alex had disappeared, a doorway stood open that hadn't been there before, a black void stretching into nothingness. "He didn't go in there," I whispered. Max clenched his jaw. "Then where is he?" Before I could answer, the air turned deathly cold, and the whispering returned, louder, insistent. This time, I understood. It wasn't just voices. It was chanting. A low, guttural sound that didn't come from one source but many, surrounding us, pressing in on all sides. I felt dizzy, my vision blurring. The symbols on the walls pulsed like veins filled with black blood. Then something moved in the doorway. A shadow stepped forward, slow and deliberate. It wasn't Alex. It was tall, unnaturally so. Its limbs long and thin, its body wrapped in what looked like rotting burial cloth. Its face. God, its face was worse than before, a hollow void, shifting and writhing like something trying to take form but failing. And in its hand, it held something, a piece of Alex's torn jacket. Max cursed under his breath, stepping back. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening now. The walls trembled, dust falling from above. "We need to get out," Daniel said, his voice tight with fear. I didn't argue. We turned and ran, the thing behind us moving with impossible speed, its movements jerky, unnatural. I could feel its presence growing closer, the shadows stretching, reaching for us. As we reached the exit, a scream tore through the ruins. "Alex!" I skidded to a stop. He was still alive. "We can't leave him," I yelled. But before anyone could respond, Sophie let out a choked sob. "It's not him," she whispered. I turned, and for a split second, I saw something in the dark. A figure standing in the black doorway. It was Alex, or something that wore his shape. His eyes were black pits, his mouth twisted in an unnatural grin. And then the ruins shook violently, the stone cracking, the shadows swallowing the doorway whole. Alex or whatever had become of him, was gone. And the curse had awakened. We ran. There was no plan, no direction, just the raw primal urge to escape. The ruins trembled behind us, the air thick with the guttural whispers that now sounded like a frenzied chant. The thing we had seen, the thing that wore Alex's face, was gone, but I could still feel its presence, lingering in the shadows, watching. Sophie stumbled, nearly collapsing onto the sand. I grabbed her arm, pulling her up, but she was shaking violently, her skin ice cold. "We have to keep moving," Daniel urged, his voice hoarse. Max turned back toward the ruins, his face twisted with frustration. "We can't just leave him." I wanted to believe Alex was still alive, that he was still him, but the thing we saw wasn't human anymore. I wasn't even sure it had ever been Alex to begin with. "We don't have a choice," I said, my voice barely steady. Max clenched his fists, his whole body trembling with anger and fear. But deep down, he knew I was right. Then the sky darkened. At first, I thought the sun was setting too fast. But then I realized this wasn't nightfall. The shadows from the ruins stretched unnaturally, creeping across the sand like living tendrils. The air grew thick, heavy, suffocating. Then came the whispers again. Only now, they weren't distant. They were right behind us. Sophie let out a sharp gasp, clutching her head. "It's inside my mind," she whimpered. Daniel grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. "Stay with us, Sophie. Stay with me." But she wasn't listening. Her eyes were glazed over, her lips moving rapidly, as if she were whispering along with the voices. Then the ground beneath us shifted. I turned just in time to see something rise from the sand. Long skeletal hands clawing their way out of the earth. One of them latched onto Sophie's ankle. She screamed, thrashing, but its grip was too strong. "Get it off her!" Max shouted. Daniel dropped to his knees, grabbing at the decayed fingers, trying to pry them loose, but more hands emerged. The sand wasn't just sand anymore. It was swallowing us. Max grabbed a rock and smashed it against the hand gripping Sophie. The bones cracked, but it didn't let go. In desperation, I reached down and clawed at the sand, trying to free her leg. My fingers scraped against something solid beneath the surface. Not just bones. Something larger. Something buried. Then I saw it. A skull, not human. It was elongated, misshapen, its eye sockets deep and hollow, as if it had been screaming for centuries. And I realized we weren't standing on a beach. We were standing on a mass grave. Something ancient, something unspeakable, had been buried beneath this island. And now we had woken it up. Sophie let out a strangled cry, and then, with one final yank, Max freed her. The skeletal hand snapped and crumbled into dust. We hauled Sophie up, but she was sobbing, her body convulsing. The sky was almost black now, the ocean beyond it turning still, too still. The waves had stopped moving. The entire world felt like it was holding its breath. "We need to get to the boat," Daniel said. "Now." We bolted. The jungle that had once seemed so dense and overgrown now felt endless, as if the path back to the shore had stretched infinitely. The trees loomed higher, their twisted branches reaching down like grasping fingers. The air smelled wrong, like decay and salt and something deeper, something ancient. Then ahead of us, I saw the boat. Relief flooded through me for half a second, until I saw what was standing between us and our only way off the island. Alex, or at least what was left of him. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, his black eyes staring at us, his mouth was twisted into that same unnatural grin. But his body was wrong. His arms were too long, his fingers stretched unnaturally. His skin looked cracked, like porcelain about to shatter. And then he spoke. Not with his mouth, with all of them. The whispers poured from his open grin, overlapping, voices upon voices speaking in a language that didn't belong to this world. The air around him warped, the sand beneath his feet shifting unnaturally. Max took a step forward, his voice shaking. Alex? The thing in front of us moved its head slightly, as if considering, then slowly, its grin widened. Not Alex. Then it lunged. The thing moved faster than anything I had ever seen. We barely had time to react before it was upon us, its fingers stretching outward like claws. Max shoved Sophie toward the boat. Go! Daniel grabbed an oar from the sand and swung it with all his strength. The wood connected with the thing's torso, but it barely flinched. Instead, it grabbed Daniel's wrist and began to pull. Daniel let out a scream as his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. The thing wasn't just holding him, it was absorbing him. His skin started to darken, veins turning black as the shadow spread from the creature's grip. I didn't think. I just reacted. I grabbed the knife from my belt and drove it into the creature's shoulder. It let out an unearthly screech, more like 100 voices screaming at once, and let go of Daniel. He collapsed to the sand, his arm limp and shaking. Max grabbed him, hauling him toward the boat, while I stumbled backward, gasping for breath. The thing, Alex's body, twisted unnaturally, its grin faltering. The shadows around it began to pulse, almost as if it was struggling to hold its shape. That was our only chance. Get in the boat, I screamed. We pushed off the shore, our hands shaking as we clambered aboard. The oars cut through the water, but the ocean felt thick, like moving through something alive. On the shore, the creature stood watching. It didn't follow. It didn't need to. As the boat drifted farther from the island, the whispers didn't fade. They grew louder, and then, just as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. The sky returned to its normal color. The ocean rippled again. The island, the ruins, the creature. They all looked as if they had never moved, never changed. But something had. I turned to look at Daniel, still clutching his arm, his skin pale and clammy. Sophie was curled up, her eyes hollow. Max was staring at the island, his face unreadable. And then he whispered the words that sent a new kind of terror through me. We didn't escape. I followed his gaze, my heart pounding. On the distant shore, standing at the water's edge, was Alex, smiling,